Welcome. I am Melesias. We are stepping onto a windswept, fog-shrouded moor in the wild west of England. A place where the cry of a lonely bird is interrupted by a sound far more terrifying, the distant, blood-chilling howl of a gigantic hound. We are about to encounter a mystery so strange, a legend so terrifying, that it required the return of the one man capable of solving it. We are opening The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. By 1893, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a man at war with his own creation. Sherlock Holmes, the cold, calculating, and utterly brilliant detective, had made him one of the most famous writers in the world. And Doyle hated him for it. He felt that his historical novels, his true passions, were being suffocated by the public's insatiable appetite for the man in the deerstalker cap. And so, in a final, desperate act of creative liberation, he did the unthinkable. He killed Sherlock Holmes. At the Reichenbach Falls, locked in mortal combat with his nemesis, Professor Moriarty, the great detective plummeted into the abyss. The public was devastated. Men wore black armbands in the streets of London. Doyle was inundated with hate mail. But he was resolute. Holmes was dead, and he would stay dead. For 8 long years, Doyle held firm. He wrote about the Napoleonic Wars, about medieval knights, about anything but the detective. But a story was brewing in his mind, a tale not just of crime, but of ancient legend, Gothic horror, and a terrifying beast that stalked the wild, misty moors of Dartmoor. It was a perfect mystery, but it needed a perfect detective. And so, in 1901, a new Sherlock Holmes story began to appear in the Strand magazine. The public went wild. But here was the ingenious twist that made them gasp and then laugh. Doyle did not bring Holmes back from the dead. He simply told a story that had happened before the fall. It was a masterstroke of literary resurrection, a way to give the public what they wanted without admitting defeat. And in doing so, he wrote what many consider to be the finest detective novel ever written. So, pour yourself a strong cup of tea. Draw your chair closer to the fire. The moor is waiting. The hound is howling. And the game, as a great man once said, is afoot. Let us begin. Part 1, The Legend and the Heir. Our story begins not with a crime, but with a walking stick. A very fine, solid, well-polished walking stick, left behind in the haste of a morning visitor at 221B, Baker Street. Dr. John Watson, the ever-loyal chronicler of his friend's genius, picks it up, turns it over, and, as he has been trained to do by years of observation, attempts to deduce the nature of the man who owns it. He concludes, with great satisfaction, that the visitor is a successful, elderly, country doctor who walks a great deal. He presents his findings to Holmes, who, as expected, demolishes them with a few quiet, almost apologetic words. "My dear Watson," he says, with a faint, tired smile, "you see, but you do not observe. The stick belongs to a young man under 30, who is amiable, unambitious, and owns a dog which is roughly smaller than a terrier." Watson, as always, is both humbled and deeply impressed. The owner of the stick, a young Canadian gentleman named Sir Henry Baskerville, is soon to arrive, and before he does, he has left with Holmes and Watson a document far stranger than a forgotten accessory. It is a manuscript, old and yellowed with age, written in a spidery, fading script. It is a legend, the story of the origin of the curse that has plagued his family for over 150 years. It tells the tale of his infamous ancestor, Sir Hugo Baskerville, a man of most infamous, cruel, and dissolute character. This Sir Hugo, inflamed with lust for a yeoman's daughter, kidnapped her and locked her in an upper chamber of his great hall. When she escaped, he set after her across the moonlit moor, baying for her blood like a demon. His friends, who followed, found the girl dead of terror and exhaustion. And standing over Sir Hugo's body, tearing out his throat, was a foul thing, a great, black beast, larger than any mortal hound, with eyes that blazed with hellfire. The legend warns every son of the Baskerville line never to cross the moor at night, lest they meet the same terrible fate. Watson, ever the rationalist, calls it a fairy tale. But Holmes, staring at the document, seems strangely thoughtful. A fairy tale, he observes quietly, that has just killed the last lord of the manor. Sir Henry Baskerville is everything the walking stick suggested and more. He is young, tanned from the Canadian sun, with a pleasant, open face and an unshakable, almost reckless, optimism. He is not afraid of the old legend. He is, however, deeply puzzled and disturbed by the recent and very real death of his uncle, Sir Charles Baskerville. Sir Charles, a kindly old man who had made his fortune abroad and returned to his ancestral home to do good for the local community, had been found dead in the famous yew alley of Baskerville Hall, a long, dark path bordered by ancient, twisted trees. The official cause of death was a heart attack. But the look of abject terror on his face, as reported by the local doctor, told a different story. And next to his body, clearly imprinted in the soft, damp ground, were the footprints of a gigantic hound. This last detail, which the local police had tried to suppress to avoid a panic, is what brings the case to Sherlock Holmes. He listens, and then asks Sir Henry a single, curious question. "What do you intend to do?" Sir Henry, with the unthinking courage of a colonial, replies that he intends to go to Baskerville Hall. "There is no devil in hell, Mr. Holmes," he says with a confident smile, "and no ghost on Dartmoor." Holmes, with a strange, unreadable expression, simply nods. He will not be going to Dartmoor himself, he explains. A matter of the utmost importance, a blackmailing scandal of a most delicate nature, requires his presence in London. Sir Henry, he says, must go to his ancestral home, but he must not go alone. He will send with him the one man in England whose courage is as steady as his nerves, and whose company, he adds with a thin smile, is almost as invaluable as my own. He turns to his friend. "Watson," he says, "I can only say that I shall be happy if you will accompany Sir Henry." And so, the trap is set. Sir Henry, the unsuspecting heir, will go to the Hall. Watson, the steadfast chronicler, will be his protector and, secretly, the eyes and ears of Sherlock Holmes. The investigation is about to move from the comfort of Baker Street to the wild, windswept, and terrifying isolation of Dartmoor. Part 2, Watson on the Moor. The journey from the grimy, reassuring bustle of London to the vast, silent emptiness of Dartmoor was a shock to the senses. Sir Henry Baskerville, sitting opposite Watson in the train carriage, was full of a buoyant, youthful energy. He spoke eagerly of his plans for the estate, of the modernizations he would bring, of the good he would do for the local community. His optimism was, Watson thought, both admirable and, under the circumstances, deeply unsettling. The shadow of the legend hung over him, but he seemed determined to ignore it, as a man might ignore a portrait whose eyes follow him around the room. As the train drew closer to its destination, the gentle, rolling green hills of the English countryside gave way to something older, wilder, and infinitely more forbidding. The land flattened and darkened. The trees became stunted and twisted by the wind. Great, rocky tors, the skeletal remains of ancient volcanoes, jutted from the earth like the bones of a buried giant. And everywhere, stretching to the horizon, was the moor itself, a vast, undulating sea of olive green and brown, broken only by the glint of distant, treacherous bogs. Sir Henry, for the first time, fell silent. Watson saw his face, and the excitement had been replaced by something else. A slow, creeping awareness of the immense, indifferent power of the place he now owned. At the small, lonely station, they were met by a carriage, and the drive to Baskerville Hall was a journey into deepening shadow. The road wound through a dark, primeval wood, where the ancient oaks hung low and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. When the great house finally came into view, it was not a welcoming sight. It was a vast, grey, stone building, heavy and imposing, its long, low frontage of granite looking less like a home and more like a mausoleum. Two medieval towers, worn by centuries of wind and rain, flanked the main entrance. The windows were dark and, Watson noted with a soldier's eye, would be utterly impossible to defend. A chill, he later wrote, went down his spine, and it was not from the cold air. As they stepped from the carriage, a resounding, mournful howl echoed across the nearby moor, a sound so lonely and so piercing that it seemed to freeze the very blood. Sir Henry, true to his character, straightened his back and forced a smile, but his hand, Watson noticed, was gripping his walking stick with a new, white-knuckled intensity. They were greeted by the butler, a tall, gaunt, and imposing figure named Mr. Barrymore, and his wife, the housekeeper, a dark, silent, and perpetually weeping woman. They were a strange pair. Barrymore had a magnificent, jet-black beard and the solemn, mournful air of an undertaker. His wife, by contrast, seemed consumed by a secret, unutterable grief. Her eyes were perpetually red, and she would often be found weeping in quiet corners of the vast, echoing house. The Barrymores, Watson learned, had been in the service of the family for many years, and their loyalty was, by all accounts, absolute. Yet, there was something in their manner, a shared, unspoken tension, that aroused the old soldier's deepest suspicions. The days that followed were a strange and disorienting blur of fresh air and creeping dread. Watson, with his methodical, military mind, set about trying to understand the geography of the place and the character of its inhabitants. The nearest neighbors were a brother and sister, the Stapletons. Mr. Stapleton was a thin, excitable, and bespectacled naturalist, a man who seemed to know every plant, every bird, and every treacherous inch of the great Grimpen Mire, a vast, deadly bog on the edge of the estate. His knowledge of the mire, Watson noted, was unsettlingly intimate. He was accompanied by a woman who was introduced as his sister, a dark, exotic, and intensely beautiful creature, whose Spanish features hinted at a fiery, passionate soul. She was a striking, almost jarring contrast to the bleak, grey landscape. Stapleton, Watson soon learned, was a man of contradictions. He was a passionate scholar who also, on occasion, displayed a sudden, explosive temper. He was generous with his time and yet oddly possessive of his beautiful sister. On one occasion, when Watson and Sir Henry met Miss Stapleton alone, she urgently whispered a frantic and inexplicable warning to the young baronet: "Go back to London. Go back immediately." She would not explain why, only that her brother would be furious if he knew she had spoken. The mystery deepened. The warnings multiplied. And then, there were the Barrymores. One night, Watson was woken by a faint, stealthy sound. He crept into the corridor and saw, in the dim moonlight, the tall, dark figure of the butler, holding a candle, moving towards a window. Barrymore stood there, his face pale and intent, signaling out into the darkness of the moor with the flickering light. Watson, his blood running cold, realized he was witnessing a secret communication. The servant was in league with someone, or something, out on the desolate, haunted moor. When confronted, Barrymore, with a shamefaced and desperate look, eventually confessed. The escaped convict, Selden, the Notting Hill murderer, was his wife's brother. The weeping woman was not mourning a family curse, she was a sister, terrified for a brother who was a brutal killer, hiding on the moor. They had been bringing him food and clothing, and the signal was to let him know it was safe. This, Watson felt, was a significant piece of the puzzle, but it did not explain the Hound. It did not explain the terror that had killed Sir Charles. And it did not explain a sound that Watson himself had heard one night, a long, low, and utterly blood-curdling howl that had risen from the fog-shrouded heart of Grimpen Mire. It was not the howl of any creature he knew. It was a sound from a nightmare. The human culprit was found, the inhuman terror remained. And Watson, alone and increasingly afraid, found himself drawn to the wild, empty, and threatening landscape, searching for clues. It was on one such solitary walk that he made the most astonishing discovery of all. He had noticed a mysterious figure, a solitary man, standing high upon a distant tor, his silhouette sharp against the grey sky. The man was not Selden. He was too still, too watchful, too deliberate. Intrigued and unnerved, Watson climbed the rocky hill the next day. Among the ancient, crumbling stone huts that dotted the summit, he found a simple, hidden shelter. Inside, neatly arranged, were tins of food, a billy can, and the unmistakable signs of an intelligent, organized occupant. And then, he saw it. A note, written in a hand he knew as well as his own. "My dear Watson, I trust you are well. I have been following the case from a distance. The master had been on the moor all along. He was not in London. He was here, orchestrating everything from the shadows, living like a wild animal on the cold, desolate hilltop. The game, as the man himself might say, was truly, and secretly, afoot." Part 3, Holmes from the Shadows and the Face of the Beast. The reunion of Holmes and Watson in the ancient stone hut on the moor was, for Watson, a moment of profound shock and overwhelming relief. For Holmes, it was, characteristically, a moment of quiet, self-satisfied amusement. He sat there, haggard and unshaven, wrapped in a heavy coat against the damp chill, looking less like the world's greatest detective and more like a vagrant who had lost his way. But his eyes, sharp and piercing as ever, sparkled with the thrill of the chase. "I think, my dear Watson," he said, with a thin, tired smile, "that you have put on 7.5 pounds since I last saw you." Watson, who had been terrified for his friend's safety, was momentarily speechless. "Holmes," he finally stammered, "I am delighted to see you." The pieces of the puzzle, which had seemed so disparate and confusing to Watson, were now, under Holmes's calm, methodical direction, clicking into place with terrifying speed. Holmes revealed that he had been on the moor for days, living in this desolate shelter, observing every character in the drama without their knowledge. He had seen the Barrymore's signal, understood its true, human meaning, and dismissed it as a domestic complication, not the heart of the mystery. He had studied Stapleton, and what he had discovered was devastating. The naturalist was not who he claimed to be. He was, in fact, a long-lost Baskerville, a nephew of Sir Charles, with a direct claim to the estate. His real name was Roger Baskerville, and he was a man of violent passions and a criminal past, who had fled to South America and was believed dead. He had returned with a new identity and a single, burning ambition, to claim the Baskerville fortune. The beautiful woman he called his sister was, in reality, his wife, a Costa Rican beauty who was both his accomplice and his prisoner. The pieces were falling into place. The legend of the Hound was not a ghost story. It was a weapon. A weapon of terror, wielded by a cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless man. The method of Sir Charles's murder was now clear. Stapleton, knowing the old man's weak heart and his terror of the family legend, had acquired a monstrous beast cross between a bloodhound and a mastiff and kept it hidden in the heart of the Grimpen mire. He had painted the creature with a luminous, phosphorescent paint, transforming a mere animal into a spectral demon from the old legend. On the night of the murder, he had unleashed the beast upon Sir Charles, who, at the sight of the glowing, hellish apparition, had fled in terror and died of a massive heart attack. The legend had killed him, just as Stapleton had planned. And now, Sir Henry was the next target. The only question was how to catch a man who was protected by an impenetrable fortress of fog and treacherous bogs. The answer came in the form of a trap. Sir Henry, at Holmes's secret instruction, was to be the bait. He was invited to a dinner at the Stapletons that very evening. Afterwards, he would walk home alone, across the dark, foggy moor, along the very path where his uncle had met his end. Holmes and Watson, armed with revolvers, would be waiting in the shadows. And Inspector Lestrade, summoned by telegram, would be hidden nearby. As the night fell, a thick, clammy, and treacherous fog began to roll in from the mire, blanketing the landscape and reducing visibility to almost nothing. Waiting in the cold, damp darkness, even Holmes's iron nerves began to fray. "I cannot think how he is to cross the mire tonight," he whispered to Watson. And then, a sudden, terrifying scream shattered the silence. It was not a cry of fear. It was a cry of pure, animalistic triumph. A huge, black shape, a hellhound with fire dripping from its jaws, burst from the fog and hurled itself down the path towards the terrified Sir Henry. 2 shots rang out in the darkness. The beast screamed, a cry of mortal agony, and fell dead, its massive body just inches from the paralyzed baronet. The hound was real. Its coat was covered in glowing phosphorus. And it was dead. The hunt was not over. The master was still to be found. They rushed to Stapleton's house, but the naturalist, hearing the shots, had fled. Following his trail through the dark, fog-shrouded moor, they found his boots abandoned on the edge of the great Grimpen mire. A trail of his footprints led out onto the bright green surface of the bog, and then, suddenly, stopped. The treacherous, sucking quicksand had claimed its victim. The man who had used the mire as his hiding place and his weapon had, in the end, been consumed by it. The case of the Hound of the Baskervilles was over. The supernatural was laid to rest. And the rational, the observable, and the human, in all its terrifying complexity, had been laid bare. In the quiet of the train carriage back to London, Holmes turned to his companion with a look of quiet satisfaction. "The game is over, Watson. And I think, for once, the legend is well and truly dead." Epilogue: The evil behind the legend. And so, the great mystery of the Hound of the Baskervilles was solved. The beast was real, but it was not a phantom. The terror was genuine, but its source was profoundly, and terrifyingly, human. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, through the cool, rational voice of Sherlock Holmes, does not just tell us a ghost story. He dissects one. He shows us how a legend, born of ancient fear and family sin, can be twisted into a weapon of murder by a mind that is cold, calculating, and utterly without conscience. The true horror of the book is not the hound itself. It is the man who used it. The man who understood that a ghost is far more terrifying than a bullet, and that a legend, once believed, can kill. And yet, as always, the story is saved from utter darkness by the light of friendship and intellect. By the quiet, unshakable courage of Watson, who walked on to that moor every day, knowing the danger, but trusting in his duty. And by the brilliant, eccentric, and deeply humane genius of Sherlock Holmes, who reminds us that there is no mystery so dark, and no terror so profound, that it cannot be dispelled by the simple, beautiful, and relentless application of reason. I am Melesias. This has been the story of the Hound of the Baskervilles, as I have understood it. Thank you for listening. If this journey through fog and fear has moved you, please subscribe. And remember, the next time you hear a howl in the dark, look for the man behind the monster. Until next time.